الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Praise be to God, the Lord and cherisher of all the worlds. We witness that he is one, the creator of all the worlds, the heaven and the earth. And we witness that Muhammad, to whom the Quran was revealed over 1,400 years ago, is the seal of the prophets. Dear listeners, we're going to talk about the whole issue of the development of the modern West in some sense in terms of the relationship of secular and religious ideas, and also the separation of politics from religion and religion from politics, and religion from, or religious values from, the intellectual life of man as well. Before I start, I'd like to make some underlying assumptions in terms of my overall talk. God is one, religion is one, mankind is one. When I will be speaking in these talks in terms of the Western worldview or the Islamic worldview, I'm talking about different inflections and not a demarcation or a bifurcation between these worldviews that is inseparable, but that there are different tendencies as a consequence of different historical developments and a different historical imagination as a consequence. I'd like to begin with a quote from Guy Eden. This concept or principle is usually attributed, or as the originator of this concept or principle is usually attributed to the French philosopher Foucault, and it goes like this. This is a quote of Guy Eden, though. Quote, "Just as each age has its own pattern of assumptions which are taken for granted, in every age, so in every age, there are certain ideas which appear by their very nature improbable. No process of reasoning is required to establish this improbability. And because the products of the period, its art and architecture, the human environment, the things men do, and the things they make, both reflect and reinforce certain assumptions, the improbable soon becomes quite unimaginable. Everything in the environment except virgin nature and certain relics of the past then confirm these assumptions, and an effort of will is required to think about them critically, let alone skeptically. It is impossible to speak of any aspect of modernity without reference to the modern West because of the Western intellectual and institutional hegemony of the modern world. We can see this in modern economic systems, whether it's the World Bank or the IMF or the United Nations. All of these modern institutions, whether it's the social sciences or the humanities, they are a product. They come out of the womb of Western civilization, and they bear the stamp of Western civilization. This is undeniable. The lingua franca in the world today, the dominant language that prevails throughout the world today, is English. That is a fact that is undeniable. There's a big step, however, from the recognition of Western dominance in the modern world to assume the premise that this civilization is universal and all communities and civilizations are destined because of an unstoppable evolutionary process to assume dominant Western characteristics. One of the most dominant features of the modern West, or the modern Western worldview, is secularism. And I know there's some intellectual or some academic contention in terms of the role of secularism or what secularism is. I'm using it as a very loose term. And I will define secularism as the goal to marginalize religious values in the social, intellectual, and political life of mankind. It is assumed to be one of the most dominant features of the modern Western worldview is secularism. It is assumed to be universal in character and modern. What is more, most intellectuals in the West, including prominent Western Orientalists, believe that secularism must be an accepted component of not only a Muslim modernity, but any modernity. W.M. Watt points out in his chapter, Towards the Future, that, quote, although the emerging world culture will be dominated by secular aspects of the Western intellectual outlook, it still remains open for the adherents of the world religions to complement this by something of their own religious culture. The secular Western outlook is a framework within which they have to operate. But within that framework, there is an opportunity for them to express their own experience of life, unquote. This not only reflects a pervasive position within the West, but has influenced areas outside the West as well. Embedded in the description of this emerging world culture is a definition of religion that is Western in origin and marginal as opposed to central as to its role in constructing any future modernity. It also assumes that the existing cultures and communities, quote, have to operate, unquote, within the analytical framework of Western thought. The assumed unstoppable evolutionary progression toward a Western secular modernity should be seriously questioned. As Ahmed notes, quote, today nobody can claim that after a certain stage of industrialization and modernization, Muslim masses as a whole will adopt Western styles of thought and life, due to the reality that Islam is considered as an alternative Welton Shao'un worldview to the Western philosophical political tradition, rather than from the perspective of the, quote, ideological intransigence of Islam vis-a-vis the Western world today, unquote, Chrome and Hens, because Muslims might equally be accused, might equally well accuse the West of, quote, ideological intransigence, unquote. This sense of Islam as an alternative worldview is a perspective which assumes a theoretical position where Islam plays a central and foundational role for an Islamic modernity. It also recognizes the comprehensive nature of Islam as a religious system, as opposed to other religious systems that could live with a marginalized role in social and political life. Our frame of reference has a great deal to do with the way we perceive the world, the culture to which we belong, the language we speak, the histories we participate in, and how others perceive us. We interact with the world in which we live with basic assumptions, which are both asserted and assumed and never asserted. Those assumptions are part of a larger worldview to which we adhere, whether we are cognizant of it or not. One of the cardinal assumptions of the modern Western thought, is, quote, to quote Hans Kung, God does not exist, unquote. One writer defines as a distinguishing aspect of modernity, quote, a loss of faith in transcendence, unquote. Secularism has been and still is an important feature of the modern Western worldview and its concomitant systems of modern thought. Secularism, as a global phenomenon, propagated by the West, sought to marginalize the transcendental normative principles in religious institutional arrangements from the political, social, and intellectual life of man. There was an explicit effort to create a cadre of intellectuals who embraced and propagated this worldview. The trend in the West since the Enlightenment to secularize the social, political, and intellectual aspects of life led to the development of a unique perspective of science and philosophy based exclusively on rationalism and empiricism for an understanding of not only the natural order, but the social order as well. Tarnas, in his chapter on the foundation of the modern world, notes how the West arrived at this intellectual point of departure. Quote, in lieu of religious or metaphysical overviews, the two bases of modern epistemology, rationalism and empiricism, eventually produce their inherent metaphysical entailments, while modern rationalism suggested and eventually affirmed and based itself upon the conception of man as the highest or ultimate intelligence. Modern empiricism did the same for the conception of the material world as the essential or only reality. That is to say, secular humanism and scientific materialism, respectively, unquote. This assumed intellectual point of departure was articulated recently by the noted physicist Stephen Hawking. He asserts, quote, what is not measurable by physicists does not exist in reality, unquote. Thus, rational man becomes the criteria of what is reality, and that reality is exclusively material. The rationalism of Descartes establishes human reason as the only criteria to assert truth, to ascertain truth, and an extreme skepticism of everything as the guiding principle to arrive at the truth. It resulted in a dualism between the mind and the world, the mind and the body, the mind conscious of its existence, but uncertain whether the world exists as the mind perceives it. This eventually aided the development of relativism, meaning all creeds, all perspectives are equally acceptable. Secularism is seen as an inappropriate conceptual and existential feature of any Islamic modernity. Tawheed is seen as a more appropriate paradigm for dealing with the challenge of contemporary history and for confronting the Muslim intellectual legacy. It is an effort to sketch out an appropriate approach to modernity. Muslim intellectuals are developing strategies to create a continuity with the past in order to create an authentically structured future. Westernization and secularization have made tremendous inroads into Muslim society. Attitude towards this phenomena in the Muslim world have varied in the various periods of this process, from inattention to active advocates. There is awareness today among Muslim intellectuals that there is an urgent need to develop Islamic theoretical and institutional frameworks for integration on an Islamic basis. The contemporary phase of Islamic resurgence is not just an effort to establish an Islamic state or to reestablish the Sharia within Muslim society, but an awareness and a desire to confront a theoretical, philosophical, political, economic, and powerful institutional orienting enterprise. This enterprise is embedded within a particular civilizational matrix, which has created the distinguishing features of the particular models of modernity in which we live, such as the modern nation state, and the root metaphors and configuration of the disciplinary matrix within which modern social sciences and humanities operate, and how these act and interact with the social reality. Western claims, for example, of an objective, value-free social science and its resulting theoretical and intellectual lack of coherence and integration as a system of thought has come under attack in the West itself. Quote, "One thing that bothers some observers of the social sciences is that the foundations of the field seem to be essentially contestable. Diverse schools of thought, each identified with some founding father, Freud, Marx, Darwin, Skinner, Paget, Adam West, or rebellious progeny, Jung, Sullivan, Rogers, Kohut, conceptualized mind, motivation, society, and nature in somewhat different ways. The basic concepts and root metaphors of each school are difficult to coordinate or translate. And if one school makes the rare effort to coordinate viewpoints and succeeds from its point of view in translating into its own terms the concepts of the other school, that other school is quick to complain that something essential has been lost in the translation. Within the social sciences, there seem to be so many perspectives and no detached way to choose among them. And those diverse perspectives seem neither to be perspectives on exactly the same thing nor perspectives on entirely different things. There may well be a continuing competition for political domination and unification of the field, that is to say, control over editorships of journals, etc. But at the higher levels of intellectual activity, things are essentially multi-paradigmatic, unquote. If modern systems of thought, that is to say, particularly the social sciences and the humanities, reflect certain Western presuppositions, metaphysical and theoretical commitments, and notions of God, man, and nature framed within a particular cultural and historical context, and formulated to address particular questions and problems unique to the requirements of Western civilization. Then Muslim civilization, modern Muslim intellectuals assert, need to formulate a theoretical framework which reflects the Islamic conceptual and intellectual identity. The need to formulate an independent theoretical path has been reinforced by the growing environmental, economic, and social problems created by following Western models in the West and outside. Vold indicates how the perception of the, quote, failure of the West, unquote, is not only in not only spiritual terms, but material terms as well, has resulted in a search for Islamic answers to a future modernity. Quote, "One of the fundamental ideals behind the process of Westernization, the idea of development, was being questioned in a variety of ways throughout the globe. The concern about the destruction of the natural environment that followed development in Western societies. The growing belief that underdevelopment in non-Western societies was related not to inherent backwardness, but to the very process of development itself, and a questioning of the social and human consequences of the processes of industrialization and urbanization are examples of the profound issues raised by the contemporary situation in the West. This doubt about development has become a dimension in the question of whether or not the West can survive modernity. Thus, Instead of having to accept the basic analytical framework of Western thought as the definition of the ground rules for dialogue, the failure of the West makes it possible to disagree with even the basic conceptual framework, unquote. Hence, there has been a transformation of consciousness with respect to Western thought among third world intellectuals. Quote, the evolution of the early questions, which Albert Harani suggested as basic, involved the change from, quote, can a devout Muslim be modern, to Abdul's issue of whether or not a modern person could still be Muslim. In both cases, there is an assumption that the West provides the most effective model of the modern. However, in the second half of the 20th century, this assumption is being seriously challenged both within the West and in areas such as the Muslim world. In many ways, one of the basic questions now is whether or not any Western model is effective for survival in the modern world. An important conceptual element in the Islamic resurgence of recent years is the realization that it is a legitimate question to ask. Can the West survive in the modern world? Unquote. This critical perception of Western civilization and its concomitant systems of thought has resulted in a transformation of consciousness among a number of intellectuals. Vold indicates three conceptual benefits of this intellectual movement to establish authentic Islamic concepts on the basis for a future modernity. First, quote, it makes it possible to define basic ideals and solutions in ways that may not coincide with Western solutions, but which are more appropriate and authentically indigenous, unquote. Second, this conceptual framework liberates Muslim intellectual discourse. Quote, it makes it possible to judge the progress toward these goals by standards other than those set by Western ethnocentric observers, unquote. And third, it, quote, frees Muslim thinkers from the domination of certain specifically Western concepts involved in interpreting modernity, unquote. This new conceptual framework to interpret modernity in authentically Islamic terms has started a debate within the universal Muslim community. A debate regarding whether science and technology as the West has introduced it to the global community can be separated from the Western civilizational matrix, which shaped its modern history and metaphysical, theoretical, and intellectual commitments. There is also the realization that the notion of a value-free social science advocated in the West is not only undesirable, but also impossible. Rather, a social or human science which inherently presupposes certain Islamic values, for example, an explicit conception of man and society, and stresses the principle of holism, or tawheed, is more appropriate. It has liberated Muslims from Western ethnocentric concepts and notions such as secularism as necessary for continuing a conceptual basis for any future modernity. Thus, the affirmation of an authentically Islamic conceptual framework is no longer seen as a reactionary response to modern problems. This paradigm shift makes it possible to differentiate between Western and modern, thereby facilitating the development of a truly Islamic modernity. Muslim intellectuals are rethinking the basic theoretical framework of modern thought in this new phase of Islamic resurgence. Unlike Islamic modernists such as Abdul and Rashid Rida, who accepted, quote, the basic analytical framework of Western thought as the definition of the ground rules for a dialogue, unquote, with the West. In this particular phase of Islamic resurgence, Muslim intellectuals are constructing an Islamic conceptual framework which reconceptualizes basic Islamic concepts, conceptualizes new Islamic concepts, and reaffirms existing Islamic concepts which continue to remain relevant to the contemporary situation. The historical experience of Europe's relation with the role of religion in society reflects aspects of the Western worldview. In Europe, the religious establishment, that is to say the church, was institutionalized into a rigidly hierarchical structure and wield real power in the temporal realm in European society through its control of learning and land. The church owned vast tracts of land. Most of the population could not read in Europe, and learning was highly controlled through the church itself, to the point where sections of the Bible were dictated on what sections of the Bible could be read at certain times and what sections of the Bible could not be read at certain times. The European Renaissance represented a movement to liberate ideas and capital from the control of the church. Moreover, in the West, since the Enlightenment, the trend in Europe, quote, has been to secularize the social and political life of man, and this led Marx to conceive of the end of history. The end was not, however, to usher in an afterlife, but a perfect life on earth, unquote. This view of man in history became possible because of an ideological and political dogma, communism, and proved to be extremely oppressive in a social matrix, the Soviet Union and China. Michael Gillinson has described the general ethos of this period well. Quote, one of the cliches of the 18th century Enlightenment and its 19th century successors was that the mystifying and irrational forces of religion had to be swept from the minds of human beings if they were to enter the age of reason and science, and increasingly technology. Religion, it was held, might have dominated an earlier stage of history or characterized a phase in the development of society, but it had to give way to new forms of association and social relations, unquote. Thus, when we think of religion in the West, a number of ideas come to mind that reflect our understanding of religion. We often assume, when we look at other conceptions of religion in other civilizations, that religion means the same for them as it does for us. Bernard Lewis indicates this propensity of mind. I disagree with Bernard Lewis on a lot of issues, but this is one I tend to agree with him with. When we, in the Western world, nurtured in the Western tradition, and I might add, I am in the Western world, and I have been nurtured in the Western tradition. When we in the Western world, nurtured in the Western tradition, use the words Islam and Islamic, we tend to make a natural error and assume that the words, that religion means the same for Muslims as it has meant in the West. This is to say a section or compartment of life reserved for certain matters, and separable, or at least separable from other compartments of life designed to hold other matters. That is not so in the Islamic world. It was never so in the past, and the attempts in modern times to make it so may perhaps be seen in the longer perspective of history as an unnatural aberration, unquote. Religion in Islam is a comprehensive system pertaining to all aspects of life. That is to say, the internal and external life, the private and the social constitutes parts of a whole system. Islam is more concerned with ethical behavior and the principle of justice than abstract notions of good and bad. The role and idea of religion in Muslim society differed from that of European society. The global Muslim community is a community divided on a multiplicity of levels because of at least two worldviews competing with each other within this community. Secularism has been and still is an important feature of the modern Western worldview and its concomitant systems of modern thought. Secularism, as a global phenomenon propagated by the West, sought to marginalize the transcendental normative principles and religious institutional arrangements from the political, social, and intellectual life of man. Secularism in Islam can be defined as the acceptance of laws and other social and political institutions and systems of thought or thought orientations without reference to God and what God wants. The role of religion and politics in Islam has actually complemented and reinforced each other throughout Islamic history. Muslim religious personalities usually had only the ability to influence a Muslim ruler's decisions. There was no church or ecclesiastical hierarchy in the formative period. There was no church or ecclesiastical hierarchy in the formative period. Religious personalities would emerge as authorities as a consequence of the respect accorded them as a result of the intelligence and learning they exhibited in a particular society. Thus, religious personalities would attract students who in turn would propagate their teachings, and this would cause their reputation to spread. In religious matters, Islamic law played the central role. Thus, religious authorities were jurists. As one author notes, the most characteristic activity of Christian scholarship has been theology. That of Islamic scholarship has been law. Christianity is a theological religion. And I mean this in terms of the historical development of matters, not the inherent principles in terms of the religion itself. Have to make that distinction so that you don't get confused. Religion is one. God is one. Humanity is one. What I'm talking about are a particular historical imagination, a certain historical development, and as a consequence, certain things play themselves out. Certain inflections develop. Christianity is a theological religion, deeply concerned with the right articles of faith to hold. Islam is primarily an ethical religion, deeply concerned with the right thing to do. It sees civilization itself as depending upon the right way to live, unquote. Eventually, Muslim governments established a system of religious schools to produce jurists for an expanding empire, resulting in semi-organized groups of religious authorities following one of the four schools of Islamic law in the Muslim world. These authorities still did not represent a formal institutionalized group of people who could determine religious issues for the Muslim community. The idea of consensus, custom, and convention played that role in the Muslim community, and Islamic law and historical circumstances provided procedures and precedents for Muslim rulers to exercise authority almost free of the influence of religious authorities, especially regarding external and fiscal matters. Often, religious authorities actually legitimized a Muslim ruler's decisions. Sometimes they would dissent, but with grave consequences. Any jurist who cast doubt on the legitimacy of the ruler did so at his own risk. Thus, the jurist Malik was tortured under al-Mansur. Abu Hanifa was persecuted for refusing state employment, and Ibn Taymiyyah died in prison. These were all religious authorities in Islamic histories at different phases of its development. Prominent religious authorities. It was the prince who wield the real power in the temporal realm throughout Islamic history, and never the religious authorities. There were certain limits laid down in Islamic law that no Muslim ruler could violate openly, and there were times jurists could hold Muslim rulers responsible as well. It was a delicate balance of power. Today, the so-called fundamentalists are actually lay Muslims who see the religious authorities employed by the state, say in Egypt or Algeria, for instance, as legitimizers of state power and not as representatives of a religious hierarchy or even as the conscience of the community who must or even ought to be obeyed. This very weakness of the absence of an organized system of religious authority is a strength in itself because it's almost impossible to marginalize religion to the periphery of Muslim society. The 19th century reform movement, a divided society. The Islamic reform movement in the later half of the 19th century failed to really develop a viable program to reform the traditional religious institutions, especially education, to meet the new challenges confronting the Muslim world from Europe. And the fear and intransigence among the conservative elements within the traditional system who resisted any attempts to reform the system, even in the face of clear military defeats. One episode in Ottoman history should demonstrate this point. The Ottoman Empire ruled most of the Muslim world from about the 14th century till about up until the World War I. It grew in power and then it declined in power, and eventually the Europeans came in after World War I and colonized all of these lands. After a devastating defeat to Russia, in which the Ottoman naval fleet in the Mediterranean was destroyed, and Russia captured the Ottoman territories of Romania and Crimea on the Black Sea, this defeat demonstrated the technological edge Europe had gained, and military reforms were imperative if the empire was to survive. Selim III, 1788 through 1807, called for a council to study the matter and give their recommendation. A number of reports were issued by the council studying the matter. There are three positions that emerged from the group. Unquote. A, the traditional military institutions and orders should be restored to their original forms. Let's go back to the past, in other words. B, modern methods should be introduced under the pretext of restoring them to their original forms in order to avoid entanglement with the Sharia, meaning the traditional elements. Let's put on the facade as if something is happening, that we're going to create a new Islamic institution, but in fact, we're going to just adopt the Western model and institute it and shove it down your throat. C, the traditional institutions and methods are beyond remedy and therefore should be abolished altogether. We see that in the establishment of Ataturk in modern Turkey. Unquote. The first represents the intransigence of the conservatives. The second are advocates of reform with no program of reform. And the third would eventually become the dominant view. This group, however, was content to imitate the West without creating anything themselves. In other words, in the words of a Tanzimat statesman, quote, "There is no means to save the Ottoman state save by imitating the West," unquote. This view was representative of most officials of the period throughout the Muslim world. Thus, their secularization and westernization programs eventually severed the balance of power within the system and opened the system to further exploitation by European powers. Namik Kemal points this out, quote, "The Tanzimat brought the Sharia into disrepute and disfigured the civilization of the West. It thus put the destinies of the Muslims at the mercy of two unreliable powers, a government unchecked by Sharia and foreign powers unlimited in their claims to interfere under the guise of westernizing Muslims. In this way, the Tanzimat paved the way for tyranny at home and for imperialist exploitation. His prediction came true at home under the reign of the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid, 1876 to 1909, and the subsequent actions of the West proved his other prediction, unquote. The inability of reformers, however, to face the problem head-on and undertake a genuine theoretical reformation, not reformation, and revival before European economic and political pressures had reached a critical point left the door open for secularization. This resulted in a duplicitous policy of reform and the eventual bifurcation of Muslim society, separated along modern secular and traditional religious lines. The establishment of new secular schools produced a new intelligentsia of high state officials, civil servants, Western-trained lawyers and teachers who began to replace the power and prestige formerly held by traditional groups. Secular state schools and traditional religious ones existed side by side as they do today. The Ottoman Caliph Sultan used to delegate authority to the offices of the Grand Vizier and the Sheikh al-Islam to execute his commands. Now these responsibilities were divided among a group of ministers. A new system of administrative organization for the bureaucracy with impersonal civil servants was established. Eventually, the secular elite elements within the government were dominant, and the new techniques and organizational skills made that government increasingly powerful within its own immediate society. Although the new secular elements had gained the quest to obtain power, they had failed to establish the basis on which to legitimize that power. The religious authorities in the past had legitimized the authority of the Muslim ruler on the basis of his enforcement of the Sharia, whether it was a facade or not. Even though his enforcement was a fiction, sometimes he still gave lip service to the Sharia and demonstrated his ability to protect Muslim communities from non-Muslim attack. The new secular rulers rejected the Sharia and were even unable to protect Muslim populations as well. The delicate balance that existed between religion and politics throughout much of Islamic history was severed. In the modern period, the modern state sought either to appropriate religion entirely or to marginalize it to the periphery. And I'll stop there and pick up next time. Are there any questions? Yes.
On the, you're running the relationship of the Christian and the Muslim.
Yes.
But the Jews don't mix in there at all. How come?
Because Jewish society did not really establish itself in terms of the temporal sphere. It was never able to really establish itself until the establishment of the State of Israel. And in terms of the actions of the Sharon and his supporters, they have lost all moral efficacy in terms of what they're doing to the Palestinians. You can't justify that kind of action. You can't justify it on the basis of the high principles in the Torah. You can't justify that kind of action. So there is a disconnect between the high principles of the Torah and what Sharon and his supporters are doing.
My question was, and you made me think of another point as well. When we discuss secularism, and when the church had almost complete control over a person's life, and when the secular way came in,
yes,
one of the most important aspects of what the Jews did was shoulder the financial thing. In other words, for example, the Catholic community, it was against the law to loan another Catholic money with interest.
Mm-hmm.
So in studying the English civil law, Civil War, etc., when the bankers came into fruition, was a period when the secular way came in. And
Yes.
one of the things that ushered that in was that the Catholics thought it was sacrilegious to loan another Catholic money with interest.
Yes.
So what happened was they grew strong, actually. They financed many of the civil wars in European society, and they didn't participate as such. We are non-participants.
Yes.
But in reality, because of the dynamics, it was ideal for them to gain strength in the financial area. Next point is that when we discuss secularism, although the definition is accurate, but it often evaporates for this reason. When we study so-called religious sort of positions, that all of the secularist thinking individuals view all the religions the same.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first point.
Yeah.
Second point is that they view all religions the same, and when they look back historically, oftentimes when we as Muslims present this point of secularism and its limitations from an idealistical standpoint, from an Islamic standpoint, we don't have time to make a historical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, the studying the church, in fact, when the church was at its peak, it was most intolerant.
Mm-hmm.
When the Muslims were at its peak, it was the most tolerant.
Well,
So
I wouldn't say that.
Well, I say the most tolerant in regards to other religions, more completely.
What the thing that I was trying to get you to see is that there was a different kind of historical development. You see, in the development of European society, the church had real power.
Right,
To
right,
influence.
exactly, yes.
Within the development of Islamic society, religious personalities had marginal power. The state had real power. The prince. You see, you had these dynastic entities who wield real power to the point that if a religious personality came out and conflicted with state policy, he did that at his own detriment.
Right.
You see, the Crusades were led by the church, where they galvanized these large, masses of people and got them, fired up and sent them to the Holy Land to recapture them. That was the church, not the state.
Yeah, I know, but
So you have to see the differentiation in terms of real power that was held.
right, that's true.
You're making a lot of points.
Yeah, that's
and
true, but
you
what-
have to pause for
okay,
me to
let me-
respond
okay.
to them, so that if I don't agree with them, that I have to indicate my agreement, because this is going to be
Exactly.
aired.
Exactly,
okay?
right, sure. I mean, what I'm saying
Because let me say something about this whole question about the Jews coming in and all of this. What we have to understand was that there was always in all of these societies, there was always an underworld. There was always a world that operated underneath, the official world, so that, the whole question of the banking system, the lending system, all of this, a lot of this comes out of the Italian city-states. The Italian city-states in Florence, and Machiavelli talks about this, but it goes back before him. This idea of lending with interest, this was the beginning of a capitalist system. Now, the capitalist system as it exists, inherently, there's no problem with it inherently. It's only when you get the kinds of, meaning that lending money for interest as such, right? It's only when you get the coercive impact of compounded interest, interest upon interest upon interest, where it becomes oppressive, you see?
Right.
So that if the marketplace will determine what interest rates are, truly determine what interest rates are, not tariffs, not power politics, in terms of, not the whole question of, let's take our own situation. When we go to the bank and we want to get a loan, we're going to pay a higher interest than someone else, some other community who goes to the bank and get a loan. They may have identical credit, they may have identical credit history, so that this kind of imbalance, where you don't have these fair economic systems set up, where the whole question of, the way in which the system operates is inherently fair. If the market is allowed to honestly determine what rates are, and everybody is treated equally in terms of that, then I don't see any problem with it as such. Because just like you go and you rent a home, for instance, You go, you rent a home, right? You don't own the home. What are you buying? You're buying space. You're in a sense, it's interest, because what you're buying to rent that space. You don't own the home. You're not buying an interest in the home. You don't have anything. So when you go to the bank and you ask them for money, what, are they supposed to give you money with nothing in return? You see what I'm saying? So that money has a value in and of itself. And there's a time period in terms of that money, right?
Right.
So there should be some mechanism set up. And we have to say that there, as it exists in terms of the modern world, no one has offered an alternative model, really, to replace the existing model that exists in terms of the capitalist model. It's functioning, it's operable, and it can be fair if applied properly. So I just wanted to say something on that point.
Okay, let me conclude by saying this. Although the definition when we define secularism and the one you gave is really accurate, but my contention is that this is often lost because when you view history, you view what has happened in the past, most people will go away saying, well, the secular way is the best way. And for this reason, when you look in the scientific community, you study from a historical perspective, you find very radiant examples why the scientists were persecuted.
Yes.
Why people that were progressive in terms of viewing the creation, really Islamically, like a Khalifa would,
Yes.
they were persecuted.
Yes.
And often this is lost when you debate, when a person presents the whole concept of secularism. It's lost because the viewer or the person that's hearing your point are viewing all religions the same. And then they'll look at the Islamic community and see the backwardness, the lack of this, and you know, so they'll go away saying, well, that's good, it makes a good intellectual sort of exchange, but in reality, the secular way is best.
But let me comment on this in terms of science and philosophy, though. In some sense, the development of rationalism and empiricism, meaning scientific materialism and rationalism, meaning that man is the measure of all things, man is the highest form of intelligence, God has no role to play in this. In a sense, in terms of science and philosophy, it was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. As they began to discover and as they began to examine the material world, it began to substantiate the underlying assumptions that they had regarding these whole notions of man and nature, meaning that nature is material and man is the rational being who can understand nature, irrespective of anything outside of that, meaning that any operating intelligence that operates outside of this. And the discoveries in science were a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, if we look at what's happening in science today, especially in the field of physics, or cosmology and quantum physics, meaning the study of the very small and the study of the very large in creation. What scientists are beginning to discover now, I mean, they have a notion called cold black matter or cold dark matter. Cold dark matter is something that they can't see, something that they know exists. They know it exists because of the gravitational impact. They can tell that it's there, but they don't know what it is. And they have come to the conclusion that 90% of the material world is this cold dark matter. Now, they have gone from a material conception to an immaterial conception. So, you have the explosion, meaning that it's no longer a self-fulfilling prophecy anymore. So, the whole question, they have to rethink this model. The whole question of the uncertainty principle that Heisenberg indicated. You know, the uncertainty principle says that, you know, the basic principle of it, or the most The basic principle, not the basic principle, but the one that's articulated the most, is the whole question of a wave or a particle. If you measure the weight of the particle, you can't determine how fast it's going, its velocity. And if you record its velocity, then you can't determine its weight, right? And then they came to the conclusion that our observation of these particles affect how they act, our very observation of them, right? So it stands these principles, these philosophical assumptions on their head, because the very small and the very large have led to an understanding, even the whole question of reductionism, that we have to get to the smallest particle, to the smallest particle, to the smallest particle. We're going to break this thing down until we get to the very smallest thing, and then we will have our conclusion. It was the atom. Then it went from the atom to the electron. Then it went from the electron, to the nucleus of the atom, and then there was electrons and what have you. And then they broke that down. They found bosons and leptons and neutrinos and what have you. And then they come to the idea that neutrinos pass through us. They pass through us as a neutrino. They come out as a lepton or a boson, and they don't know what's going on now. Yeah. So they come up with this theory called chaos theory, right? To explain this thing. String theory, that there are four elements in the universe, right? You have the nuclear strong force, the nuclear weak force, gravity, and electromagnetism. That these are the four major forces in nature. And then they have come up with a theory to unify three of them. Gravity is the only one that's stopping them. And so they tried to come up with a theory called string theory to tie all of these things in together. If that's not Tawhid, you tell me what is.
Yeah, but yes, true. But when Hawkins talks about singularity, the secularists claim Hawkins and what you mentioned. The secularists claim that. And that's a large percentage of the problem. Now what they're having, there are deals made with the secularist thinking individual and the scientific community. It's business as usual, actually. The secularists claim that. When Hawkins talks about singularity and this and that and in his wheelchair, the secularists claim that pursuit and that whatever. And this problem, we in Islam, in fact...
But when Hawkins is talking about secularity, he's talking about the whole question of black holes.
Yes, actually singularity,
really,
yes.
That's where his study really emerged. He's not talking about a grand theory of the universe as such. His research is really limited to black holes. Exactly. And the nature of black holes. And what he's talking about is the whole question of singularity is really reserved to the question of black holes. But what I'm saying is that these notions, you see, what they have is they have theoretical and metaphysical commitments that have a long historical tradition. That it's very difficult for individuals to detach themselves from them. Just like in Muslim society, you have these very, very traditional thinking people who are attached to this long historical tradition that if you put it beside the Quran and the life of the Prophet, they're in stark contrast to one another. They don't even match with one another. But they are so committed historically to the development of these ideas and these concepts and principles that they're locked. They can't rethink